Hey guys, welcome back to the Atlas Archives. Tonight we're heading somewhere that probably wasn't at the top of your travel bucket list, and that's exactly why we're going there, Moldova. A small landlocked country in Eastern Europe that most people couldn't find on a map. And that's a genuine shame, because Moldova has one of the stranger, more turbulent, more quietly fascinating stories on the continent. It's been conquered by basically everyone. It contains a country that doesn't officially exist. It makes more wine than it knows what to do with, and it has spent most of its history being used as a doormat by its much larger, much louder neighbours. So tonight, we're going to fix the knowledge gap. We'll walk through the landscape, the ancient peoples, the empires, the Soviet experiment, and where Moldova finds itself today still standing, still pouring wine, still figuring things out. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. Always love seeing where in the world our listeners are drifting off. And if this is your first time here, welcome, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Alright, let's go to Moldova. Chapter 1. The land between the rivers. Let's start where we always start, with the land itself. Because before you can understand what happened to Moldova, you need to understand what Moldova actually is. And what it is, physically, is this: a relatively small piece of territory in Eastern Europe, sandwiched between Romania to the west and Ukraine on basically every other side. North, east, south, Ukraine. It's the geopolitical equivalent of being surrounded at a party by one person, and that one person is enormous. The country covers roughly 33,800 square kilometres, which makes it one of the smallest countries in Europe. For reference, it's about the size of the American state of Maryland, or if you're more of a visual thinker, picture a country roughly shaped like a fat comma and about half the size of Portugal. That's Moldova. It fits neatly between two rivers, the Prut on the western edge, which forms the border with Romania, and the Dniester, or Nistru as it's known locally, which runs along the eastern side. Two rivers, like a pair of parentheses, enclosing a landscape that has been fought over, divided, absorbed, and reshaped more times than is probably healthy for any single piece of real estate. The Romans were here, the Mongols were here, the Ottomans were here, the Russians were here twice. If land could develop trust issues, Moldova's land would be in therapy. Now, the first thing most people assume about this part of Eastern Europe is that it's flat. You picture a grey Soviet steppe stretching to the horizon, maybe a tractor, definitely some concrete. And that assumption is wrong, at least in Moldova's case. The central part of the country, a forested upland region called the Codri, is surprisingly hilly. Rolling green hills covered in oak and hornbeam forests, valleys cutting through the landscape, little villages tucked into the folds of the terrain. It's genuinely lovely, in a quiet, unhurried way. The highest point in the whole country tops out at around 430 metres, which isn't exactly the Alps, but it gives the landscape a soft, undulating character that catches people off guard when they finally visit. Moldova doesn't look like what people expect. It rarely does anything like what people expect. The north of the country is flatter, the Baltsi steppe, an agricultural plain where sunflowers and corn and wheat grow in enormous quantities. The south opens into a more arid, wind-swept terrain before the country pinches down to an almost comically narrow tip along the Danube. And here's a Moldova detail that genuinely delights me. Moldova technically has Danube River access. It has a port. It's called Giurgiulești. Its Danube frontage measures approximately 600 metres. 600 metres. That's about 4 city blocks. Moldova has 4 city blocks worth of access to one of Europe's greatest rivers, and it has built a small oil terminal there, presumably on the theory that you use what you've got. Technically, this makes Moldova not entirely landlocked. The Moldovans count it. You would too, if that's all you had. But here's the thing about Moldova's geography that actually matters, the thing that explains almost everything about its history and its value to outsiders: the soil. Moldova sits on top of some of the most extraordinary agricultural land on Earth. It's called chernozem black earth, and it covers roughly 3/4 of the country's surface. Chernozem is the agricultural equivalent of winning the lottery. It's deep, dark, humus-rich soil that accumulated over thousands of years of grassland decomposition, and it is absurdly fertile. Moldova's chernozem is among the thickest and richest deposits in the entire world. You can essentially point at the ground here and things grow. Wheat, corn, sunflowers, tobacco, vegetables, fruit. Moldova produces all of it in quantities that seem disproportionate to its size. There are no significant mineral resources here, by the way. No oil, no coal, no meaningful metal deposits. Moldova got none of that. What it got instead was the soil, which in the long run may have been the better deal, though. Try telling that to the string of empires that marched through here, looking for strategic advantage, and found, to their mild confusion, an extraordinarily pleasant place to grow things. The Romans noticed. The Ottomans noticed. The Russians definitely noticed. Everyone who passed through Moldova noticed the soil and quietly revised their conquest plans from exploit and leave to exploit and stay a while. And then there's the wine. Oh, there's so much wine. Moldova's climate continental, with cold winters, warm summers, and enough rainfall to keep things going without drowning them, turns out to be essentially perfect for viticulture. The country has been producing wine for thousands of years, and it produces a staggering amount of it. Per capita, Moldova is one of the highest wine-producing nations in the world. There are wineries here that would make a French sommelier sit down and have a quiet moment. The Cricova winery, just outside the capital, has underground tunnels stretching 120 kilometres, which are used partly for wine storage and partly, and I am not making this up, as an actual road network. You can drive a car through Cricova's wine cellars. People have driven cars through Cricova's wine cellars. Yuri Gagarin visited in 1966 and reportedly stayed for 2 days. The man went to space and then got lost in a Moldovan wine cave. Honestly, fair. The Molesti Mici winery, meanwhile, holds a Guinness World Record. Not for the tunnels, though they have those too, over 200 kilometres of underground galleries. The record is for the largest wine collection in the world. 1.5 million bottles, give or take, stored underground in a labyrinth beneath the rolling Moldovan hills. 1.5 million bottles. That's enough wine to give every person in Moldova roughly half a bottle each, which is probably how they cope with the winter. The Dniester River deserves its own moment, because it's not just a geographic feature, it's a dividing line that carries enormous political weight, which we'll get into in detail later. The river runs north to south, roughly parallel to the eastern border, and the land to its east, a thin strip called Transnistria, occupies a very peculiar position in European geography. Transnistria declared independence from Moldova in 1990 and has functioned as its own entity ever since, with its own government, its own currency, its own army, and a visual aesthetic that reads as the Soviet Union preserved in amber. Lenin statues still stand in the main squares. The old hammer and sickle symbol appears on the official flag. It's like someone hit pause on history in 1985 and forgot to press play again. The internationally recognised border of Moldova includes Transnistria. The actual reality on the ground does not. It's one of those situations that international lawyers love and everyone else finds exhausting. The Prut River on the western edge has a very different story. The Prut is the border with Romania, which means it's also, in a very real sense, the border between Moldova and the country that Moldova arguably is or was or could be again, depending on who you ask and how much wine they've had. The relationship between Moldova and Romania is one of the defining tensions of modern Moldovan identity, and it starts here, with this river, which has spent centuries being either a meaningless line through a unified cultural region or an internationally enforced border separating the same people from themselves. History is funny that way. Not ha-ha funny, more of a grimace. The climate, as mentioned, is continental. Winters get genuinely cold. Think -10 to -15 Celsius on a bad day, with snow that settles and stays for months, blanketing the hills in a silence that is either peaceful or oppressive depending on your disposition. Summers are hot and dry, regularly hitting 30 degrees and above, the sunflower fields turning vast swathes of the north into a yellow sea that stretches to the horizon. Spring and autumn are the country's best seasons, mild, often beautiful, the Codri Hills turning gold and amber in October in a way that photographers are only beginning to discover. Moldova doesn't get many tourists. The ones who come tend to be surprised by how pleasant it actually is, and slightly annoyed that they didn't come sooner. The country's biggest challenge has never really been its landscape. The landscape is quietly, unpretentiously gorgeous. The challenges have come from everything else. They always have. Which brings us, gently, to one of Moldova's defining modern realities. Its people keep leaving. Moldova has been called, not entirely affectionately, the country that exports its citizens. The official population sits at around 2.6 million. But economists and demographers estimate that somewhere between 1.5 and 3 million Moldovans live outside the country in Romania, Italy, Russia, Germany, Portugal, everywhere. That's a staggering proportion of a small population. In some villages, the majority of working-age adults are simply gone, sending remittances home to elderly parents and children being raised by grandparents. The countryside is visibly emptied in places. Houses stand half-finished, a common sight across Moldova, the result of an optimistic building project that ran out of money when the migrant workers' contract ended. It's a landscape shaped not just by geology and climate, but by absence. And yet the land remains extraordinary. That black earth doesn't care about emigration statistics or geopolitical disputes. It just keeps producing. Every year the sunflowers turn their faces east. The grapes ripen in the Codri valleys, and somewhere in an underground tunnel near Chisinau, another bottle of wine is quietly aging toward perfection. Moldova is a country that has been dealt difficult cards at almost every turn, squeezed between great powers, divided against itself, depopulated by circumstance. But the soil holds, the rivers run, the wine gets made, and that, in its own understated way, says something important about the place. It's a country that has learned, through long and painful experience, to find its value in the things that can't be taken away. The empires come and go, the chernozem remains. The capital, Chisinau, sits roughly in the centre of the country, a Soviet-built city on top of a much older settlement, full of wide boulevards, crumbling Khrushchev-era apartment blocks, and a surprisingly vibrant cafe culture that locals have carved out between the concrete. It's a city of contradictions. Beautiful parks alongside brutalist architecture, excellent food alongside dire infrastructure, genuine warmth alongside a pervasive exhaustion from decades of economic struggle. The old city has a faded elegance, 19th century buildings that survived Soviet redevelopment by accident. now sitting slightly stunned among the glass and concrete additions of the post-independence era. The central market sells everything from fresh produce to questionable electronics to homemade wine in unlabelled bottles, which is the most Moldovan possible shopping experience. Chisinau is a city that feels like it's always on the verge of something, always about to change, always waiting for the moment things finally click into place. The rest of Moldova feels similarly poised, patient, watching, still rooted in that extraordinary black earth, waiting to see what the next chapter brings. And the next chapter, as it turns out, starts a very long time ago, because people have been living in this particular stretch of riverine territory for an almost absurd length of time, tens of thousands of years. Long before the Romans, long before the Slavs, long before anyone thought to draw lines on a map and argue about which side you were supposed to be on. To understand Moldova now, we need to go back all the way back to when this land was just that, rich earth, 2 rivers, and the people who first figured out how good a thing that was. Chapter 2: Fire, Scythians, and the people who became Moldovans. Let's go back, not just a few centuries properly back, because the story of human habitation in this particular piece of river valley is genuinely ancient, and it starts with a civilization that most people have never heard of, which is a shame because they were doing things that shouldn't have been possible for several thousand years. This is not a region that started with the medieval period and worked forward. This is a region with deep time running through it, layer upon layer of peoples and cultures, each one building on the wreckage of the last, each one eventually becoming wreckage themselves. By the time we get to anything resembling Moldova as a political entity, we will have passed through Stone Age settlements, Iron Age kingdoms, Roman conquest, and one of the most chaotic stretches of migration in European history. Buckle in. The Dniester Valley has been occupied by human beings for somewhere in the range of 300,000 years. That's not a typo. 300,000 years of people looking at this stretch of fertile river valley and thinking, yes, this. The earliest traces are Stone Age, scattered and fragmentary flint tools, hearth remnants, the faint archaeological whisper of people who had no language we can reconstruct and no monuments we can visit. They were here, they survived, and then they were replaced by someone else. That's the rhythm of this land. It never really changes. But the first truly remarkable inhabitants, the ones who deserve a much bigger chapter in the general history of European civilization than they currently get, appear around 5,500 BCE. They're called the Cucuteni-Trypillia culture, named after 2 archaeological sites, one in Romania and one in Ukraine, with Moldova sitting neatly between them. And they were extraordinary, not in a polite, academic, remarkable for their time way. Extraordinary in a way that stops you mid-sentence when you start reading about them and makes you say, out loud to no one in particular, wait, what? The Cucuteni-Trypillia people built settlements, not villages settlements, proto-cities. Some of their sites covered over 300 hectares and housed populations estimated at between 10 and 15,000 people, 10 to 15,000 people, in roughly 4000 BCE. To put that in perspective, that's larger than most contemporary settlements in Mesopotamia, which gets all the credit for inventing urban civilization. The Cucuteni-Trypillia were building what were, by any reasonable definition, towns in the forests and hills of what is now Moldova, Romania, and Ukraine, while the rest of Europe was still living in scattered farmsteads and wondering what a wheel was for. Their pottery is astonishing. If you ever get the chance to look up Cucuteni ceramic work, and I genuinely recommend doing this, you will find objects of such elegant, intricate beauty that they look like they were made last year by a designer in Copenhagen. Swirling geometric patterns in orange, black and white, painted with a precision and confidence that suggests a long tradition of artistic mastery. These weren't functional objects with a little decoration. They were art objects that also happened to hold grain. There's a difference, and the Cucuteni people clearly understood it. And then there's the thing that makes archaeologists argue at conferences and keeps enthusiastic amateurs up at night. Every 60 to 80 years, the Cucuteni-Trypillia people burned their settlements to the ground, deliberately, completely. Every building, every structure, everything torched, and then they built again on top of the ashes. This happened repeatedly across hundreds of sites over roughly 2,000 years. We know it was deliberate because the pattern is too consistent to be accidental. We know it was total because the excavations show complete destruction events, not partial fires. What we don't know, what nobody knows, despite a century of archaeology and some very passionate academic debate, is why. The leading theories range from ritual renewal to pest control, to some form of spiritual belief about cyclical death and rebirth. The honest answer is, we have no idea. They burned everything they built, rebuilt it, and did it again, and again, for 2,000 years. Honestly, the more I think about it, the more it sounds like a very extreme form of spring cleaning. Even more striking is what the Cucuteni-Trypillia settlements don't contain. No weapons hoards, no fortifications, no warrior burials, no evidence of a military class or hereditary elite. No palaces for chiefs, no mass graves from raids, no burned villages that suggest someone else did the burning. For a culture that lasted 2,000 years across a vast territory, the archaeological record is almost eerily peaceful. Scholars argue about this, some insist we're missing something, that the evidence is incomplete. Others take it at face value. The Cucuteni-Trypillia may have been the largest, most enduring, relatively egalitarian society in prehistoric Europe. Whether that's inspiring or just confusing probably depends on your priors. Around 2700 BCE, the Cucuteni-Trypillia world ends. Not with a bang, exactly more of a slow dissolution. The timing coincides with a massive westward expansion of the Yamnaya culture. Steppe pastoralists from east of the Ural Mountains who rode horses, herded cattle, and carried with them a set of languages that would eventually become almost every language spoken in Europe today, including the one you're listening to right now. The Yamnaya were Proto-Indo-Europeans, the ancestors of the Greeks, the Romans, the Celts, the Slavs, the Germanic peoples, and yes, the ancestors of the Latin-speaking population that would eventually produce Romanian and Moldovan. They were not, by most accounts, subtle arrivals. Genetic studies of European populations show a dramatic shift around this period. The DNA signature of Cucuteni-Trypillia farming communities gets largely replaced by steppe ancestry within a relatively short window of time. What exactly that replacement looked like on the ground, whether it was violent, gradual, or some complicated combination of both, remains contested. The Cucuteni-Trypillia didn't disappear, they were absorbed. Their genes persist in modern Eastern European populations, their culture doesn't. The steppe had arrived, and it wasn't going anywhere. After the Yamnaya, the region passes through the Bronze Age in a state of cultural flux, various archaeological cultures layering on top of each other like geological strata, each one leaving traces in the soil before being replaced or transformed by the next wave. By the Iron Age, roughly the first millennium BCE, the dominant peoples in this part of the world are the Thracians, specifically a branch known as the Getae, and further north and west, the Dacians. These two groups are closely related, possibly the same people with slightly different politics, and they are significantly more interesting than their relatively low historical profile suggests. The Getae and Dacians had a sophisticated material culture, hilltop fortresses, metalwork, trade networks extending to the Greek colonies on the Black Sea coast. But what really sets them apart is their religion. They worshipped a deity called Zalmoxis, who, according to the accounts of Greek writers, who were admittedly not always reliable narrators when it came to barbarian neighbours, had at some point lived among men, retreated underground for 3 years, and then reappeared, convincing everyone that death was not, in fact, the end. Sound familiar? There's been considerable academic debate about what the Zalmoxis cult actually involved, but the broad strokes are clear enough. The Getae had a belief system centered on death, resurrection, and the immortality of the soul that predates Christianity and shares some striking structural similarities with it. Whether that's coincidence or evidence of deeper cultural currents moving through the ancient world is left as an exercise for the reader. Meanwhile, out on the steppes to the north and east, the Scythians were making themselves impossible to ignore. Iranian-speaking nomads who dominated the grasslands from the Black Sea to Central Asia, the Scythians were one of those cultures that achieved something genuinely difficult. They were simultaneously terrifying and aesthetically magnificent. Greek sources describe Scythian warriors as ferocious, fast, and deeply uninterested in standing still long enough for a conventional battle. They were horse archers of extraordinary skill, the kind of fighters who could ride at full gallop and loose arrows backwards at pursuers, which is either impressive or infuriating depending on whether you're the pursuer. Their burial mounds, called kurgans, are scattered across the steppes, including in Moldova's north, and the goldwork found inside them is some of the finest in the ancient world. Intricate animal-style decorations, ceremonial vessels, jewellery of breathtaking craftsmanship, terrifying and beautiful. The ancient world's version of a person who's great at their job and you hate them for it. The Scythians were eventually pushed out or absorbed by the Sarmatians, another group of Iranian-speaking steppe nomads, around the 3rd to 2nd century BCE. The Sarmatians are notable for several reasons, but perhaps the most entertaining is this. Greek and Roman writers reported that Sarmatian women rode and fought alongside the men. This was unusual enough and vivid enough that many scholars believe the Sarmatians are at least partly responsible for the Greek myth of the Amazons. If you've always pictured Amazons as purely mythological, here's the archaeological corrective. Sarmatian burial sites in Ukraine and southern Russia contain skeletons of women buried with weapons, including bows and swords. The myth had a model. She lived on the steppe and she could outride most men alive. And then come the Romans. In the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, the Roman Empire pushes its northeastern frontier into Dacian territory in a series of brutal, expensive campaigns under Emperor Trajan. The Dacian Wars fought in 101 to 102 CE, and then again in 105 to 106 CE, ended with the destruction of the Dacian kingdom and the creation of the Roman province of Dacia. Trajan was so pleased with himself that he commissioned a column in Rome depicting the entire campaign in carved relief, essentially a stone graphic novel of conquest that still stands in Rome today, 2,000 years later. The Dacians are the losers on that column, but they're depicted with a dignity that suggests even the Romans found them worthy opponents. Moldova sits on the eastern edge of Rome's reach. Parts of the territory were incorporated into the empire. Other parts remained in the hands of what Roman sources called the Free Dacians groups that resisted or simply lay beyond the practical limits of Roman administration. What Rome brought to the regions it did control was transformative. Roads, towns, coins, Latin. That last one matters enormously. The Latin spoken by Roman soldiers and administrators in this region didn't disappear when Rome withdrew its legions around 271 CE. It stayed, mutating slowly over centuries, absorbing Slavic vocabulary, surviving conquest after conquest, until it emerged in the medieval period as Romanian, a Romance language stranded, against all probability, in a sea of Slavic tongues. The Latin roots of modern Romanian and Moldovan trace directly back to those Roman garrisons on the Dniester. Every time a Moldovan says a word derived from Latin, they're carrying 2,000 years of history in their mouth without knowing it. After Rome retreated, the region entered what historians call the migration period, which is a polite way of saying that for several centuries, every major people group in Eurasia seemed to be passing through this particular corridor at speed. The Goths came through heading west. The Huns came through heading west faster. The Avars followed. The Bulgars. Each wave left something behind: genes, place names, occasionally mass graves before moving on or being absorbed by the next arrivals. Attila the Hun's empire, at its peak in the mid-5th century, had its western frontier running through this very region. Attila himself probably crossed this land more than once. He did not, by all accounts, stop to admire the chernozem. The Huns are one of those civilizations that historians struggle to say anything neutral about. They were extraordinarily effective at destruction and almost entirely uninterested in construction, which makes for a dramatic historical moment and a very thin archaeological record. They burned, they rode, they collected tribute, and then, within a generation of Attila's death in 453 CE, they essentially collapsed as a political entity and scattered into the historical record as a footnote. A very violent footnote, but a footnote. By the 6th and 7th centuries CE, Slavic peoples were filtering into the region from the north and east, gradually settling, farming, and intermarrying with the Romanized Dacian population that had persisted through all the chaos. This blending Slavic settlers mixing with Latin-speaking locals is the demographic foundation of what would eventually become the Moldovan and Romanian people. It's a complicated ancestry, spanning tens of thousands of years and dozens of cultures, woven together through conquest and migration and ordinary daily life. The people who would build the medieval Principality of Moldova were the product of all of it: the Cucuteni potters, the Dacian warriors, the Roman soldiers, the Slavic farmers layered on top of that black earth, each generation inheriting the land and the weight of everyone who had held it before them. None of them knew they were building towards something called Moldova. History doesn't come with a roadmap. It just keeps adding layers until someone eventually names the pile. Chapter 3. Stephen the Great and the Kingdom That Almost Was. By the 14th century, the layers of peoples we talked about, the Romanized Dacians, the Slavic settlers, the scattered remnants of every migration wave that had passed through had coalesced into something recognizable. A culture, a language, a loose sense of shared identity among the communities living between the Carpathians and the Black Sea steppe. What they needed now was a state, and in 1359, more or less, they got one. The founding story of the Principality of Moldova begins, appropriately enough, with a hunting trip. According to tradition and medieval founding, legends should always be taken with a light seasoning of salt. A Vlach nobleman named Dragos was sent by the King of Hungary to establish a buffer territory against the Mongol. Successor states, the Tatars, who still controlled the steppe to the east and had a habit of raiding anything within reach. Dragos was out hunting an aurochs, a wild ox, enormous and apparently not very cooperative when the animal fled across a river. Dragos chased it. The aurochs died in the river, possibly from exhaustion Possibly from sheer indignation at being chased this far, Dragos named the river the Moldova. He named the territory after the river. The aurochs head ended up on the coat of arms, which is the medieval equivalent of being immortalized against your will. And here's the detail that I find quietly wonderful. The Moldova River, the one the whole country is named after, is not actually in Moldova. It's in present-day Romania. The country is named after a river that flows entirely outside its borders. Moldova, a place named after somewhere else, which is a very on-brand way to start. Dragos is the traditional founder, but the man who actually made Moldova independent was Bogdan I, who broke away from Hungarian overlordship around 1359 and established a genuinely sovereign principality. This required a certain boldness, since Hungary was not small and did not appreciate its buffer states developing opinions. But Bogdan made it stick, and his dynasty would rule Moldova for the next century and a half. The early principality was larger than modern Moldova. It stretched north into Bukovina, which is now split between Romania and Ukraine, and it reached east to the Black Sea coast. Moldova had a coastline. It had ports. It had access to the trade routes of the Black Sea world, where Genoese merchants had established colonies and the money flowed freely. This is worth pausing on, because that coastline will be gone within a century and a half, and its loss will shape everything that follows. For the first 100 years or so, the Principality navigated the usual medieval challenges with reasonable competence, managing relationships with Hungary to the west, Poland, Lithuania to the north, and the growing power of the Ottoman Empire to the south, while keeping the Tatars of the Golden Horde from raiding the eastern borderlands. It wasn't easy. The boyars, the Moldovan nobility, had a tendency toward the kind of factional politics that made succession a recurring crisis and assassination a viable career path. Rulers came and went with uncomfortable frequency. Between 1365 and 1457, roughly the first century of the Principality's existence, Moldova went through somewhere around 30 different rulers, which works out to a reign of about 3 years per person. Some were competent, some were disasters. Several were both at once, in quick succession. Most were somewhere in between, which is, in fairness, true of rulers everywhere. What the Principality needed was someone who could actually hold it together long enough for the country to become more than a theoretical project. It needed someone extraordinary. It would get one. Eventually. And then, in 1457, Stephen took the throne, and everything changed. Stefan cel Mare, Stephen the Great, reigned for 47 years, from 1457 to 1504. He fought 36 military campaigns. He built roughly 44 churches. He was called the true athlete of Christ by a pope who was genuinely impressed. He was canonized as a saint by the Romanian Orthodox Church in 1992. He also had political rivals blinded and executed, maintained multiple simultaneous relationships that produced both legitimate and illegitimate heirs in some quantity, and operated with a political ruthlessness that would make a modern PR team quietly close their laptops and go home. He was, simultaneously, a genuine military genius, a significant cultural patron, a devout Christian by the standards of his time, and a man you very much did not want to cross. Medieval sainthood contains multitudes. The Romanian Orthodox Church decided the first 3 outweighed the 4th. Historians argue about this with the kind of polite vehemence that historians reserve for their favourite disagreements. The Moldovans, by and large, have made their decision. The statues are everywhere. Stephen inherited a principality under pressure from every direction. The Ottomans, fresh from their conquest of Constantinople in 1453, were expanding aggressively northward. Hungary and Poland both regarded Moldova as a territory that should properly be in their sphere of influence. The Tatars remained a chronic threat to the east. Stephen's response to this situation was to become, essentially, the most dangerous man in the room. He reorganized the Moldovan military, brought the boyar class to heel through a combination of political skill and strategic violence, and spent the next 4 decades fighting everyone who came at him, and largely winning. The high point came in January of 1475, at a place called Vaslui, in the Borderland Valley. An Ottoman force of somewhere between 80 and 120,000 men. The numbers vary depending on which source you trust. And medieval chroniclers had a weakness for round numbers, and dramatic effect marched into Moldova under the command of Hadim Suleiman Pasha, expecting to add another territory to the empire's growing collection. What they found instead was Stephen, roughly 40,000 Moldovan soldiers, fog so thick you couldn't see 10 meters ahead, and terrain so swampy and wooded that Ottoman cavalry advantages were almost entirely neutralized. Stephen had chosen the battlefield with surgical precision. He used the fog as a weapon, deploying horns and drums to disorient the Ottoman formations, while his forces struck from multiple directions simultaneously. The Ottomans, unable to see clearly, unable to maneuver effectively, and suddenly being attacked from angles they hadn't expected, broke. By the time it was over, the Ottoman army had been routed, with losses estimated in the tens of thousands. It was one of the largest Ottoman defeats of the 15th century, and the scale of it sent shockwaves across Europe. Stephen knew exactly what he had done. He also knew the Ottomans would be back. They always came back. News reached Rome. Pope Sixtus IV, the same pope who was in the middle of commissioning the Sistine Chapel ceiling, so he had a lot on his plate, declared Stephen the true athlete of Christ and the defender of Christianity. There was talk of a new crusade, with Stephen at its head. European powers expressed interest, admiration, and solidarity. Then they mostly went back to their own problems and sent no meaningful military support. Stephen, who had been fighting alone for years while writing increasingly pointed letters to European monarchs, asking where exactly their promised assistance was presumably unsurprised. The medieval international community's approach to collective security was, let's say, aspirational. The Ottomans came back the following year. Of course they did. At the Battle of Razbojny in 1476, they inflicted a serious defeat on the Moldovan army, devastated the countryside, and burned several towns. Stephen retreated to the Carpathian foothills, refused to surrender or negotiate, and waited. The Ottomans couldn't sustain the campaign indefinitely, supply lines were long, disease was spreading through their camp, and Stephen kept picking off foraging parties. They withdrew. Stephen came back down from the mountains, rebuilt, and kept fighting. That retreat and return pattern, refusing to accept a defeat as final, treating every setback as temporary, is arguably the defining characteristic of Stephen's generalship, and possibly of Moldova itself. Between campaigns, Stephen built. Every significant victory was commemorated with a church or monastery, a practice that sounds pious and probably was, but also served the very practical purpose of cementing his legitimacy and leaving a physical legacy that outlasted any battle. 44 churches over a 47-year reign is almost one per year, which suggests either extraordinary devotion or an unusually industrious court architect, possibly both. The monasteries he commissioned and those completed by his son Petru Raresh after him became some of the most extraordinary examples of medieval religious art in Europe. The painted monasteries of Bukovina, with their exterior frescoes covering entire walls in vivid blues, reds and ochres, depicting biblical scenes, the lives of saints, and the siege of Constantinople in remarkable narrative detail are now UNESCO World Heritage Sites. They're genuinely astonishing. Imagine the outside of a church, the exterior stone walls covered from foundation to roofline in narrative paintings, still bright after 5 centuries of Carpathian winters. Not faded, not crumbling bright. The pigments were mixed with a binding that no one has fully replicated since. The art outlasted the man who ordered it, which is probably the point. You can argue about Stephen's methods. The monasteries are beyond argument. Then came 1484, and the loss that Stephen reportedly could not forgive. The Ottomans, in a strategic pincer movement, seized the Moldovan fortresses on the Black Sea coast Cetatea Alba and Chilia, the 2 ports that gave Moldova its maritime access and its connection to the Black Sea trading world. Stephen fought to defend them and failed. Moldova lost its coastline. The country that had once stretched from the Carpathians to the sea was now landlocked, hemmed in on all sides, and its economic relationship with the Black Sea, the trade routes, the Genoese merchants, the port revenues was severed. Some accounts say Stephen wept when he received the news. Whether he did or not, the loss was profound. Moldova would never recover its sea access. The 600 metres of Danube frontage we talked about in Section 1, that tiny Giurgiulești port, is the distant, diminished echo of what Moldova once had. Stephen died in 1504, aged somewhere in his 70s, a remarkable survival record for a man who spent half a century on battlefields, was wounded multiple times, and operated in an era when infection from a minor cut could end a career faster than any enemy. On his deathbed, according to chronicles, he urged his boyars not to submit to the Ottomans, to fight on, to find allies in the west. The boyars nodded, buried him with full honours at the Putna monastery he had founded, and then fairly promptly began negotiating with the Ottomans. Which is not, historically speaking, a surprise. The boyars were realists, and Stephen's successor Bogdan the One-Eyed did not have his father's authority or military genius. The principality he left behind was intact, orthodox, culturally vibrant, and under increasing Ottoman pressure. His successors struggled to maintain his balancing act. Within decades, Moldova had slipped into the status of an Ottoman vassal state, paying annual tribute, maintaining internal autonomy, but unable to conduct independent foreign policy or form alliances without Ottoman approval. The Ottomans didn't abolish Moldova, they just put a ceiling on it, a low ceiling and getting lower. What Stephen had built, though, was something that couldn't be easily unmade, a national mythology, a saint king who had held the line against the greatest empire of his age, alone for decades, asking for help that never came and winning anyway. That story, the small principality standing firm against overwhelming odds, the ruler who fought and built and refused to quit, embedded itself deep in Moldovan and Romanian identity. It's still there. Stephen the Great appears on Moldovan currency, on statues in every major city, in the names of schools and streets and sports clubs. He's been dead for 5 centuries, and he remains the most recognisable face in the country. In a place where history has spent most of its time being difficult, Stephen is the part that felt, briefly, like winning. But the Ottoman shadow was lengthening, and to the north and west, new powers were beginning to take an interest in this small, fertile, strategically positioned principality on the edge of the steppe. The centuries ahead would bring the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Crimean Khanate, and eventually a new empire from the east that made the Ottomans look, in retrospect, almost manageable. Moldova would spend the next 3 centuries being slowly squeezed, its territory nibbled away, its autonomy reduced, its rulers increasingly picked by foreign powers rather than by any Moldovan process that deserved the name. Moldova's golden age was real, and it was remarkable. It produced one of medieval Europe's finest military commanders, some of its most beautiful religious art, and a national mythology that has sustained a people through several subsequent centuries of difficulty. It just didn't last nearly long enough. The Golden Age never does. Chapter 4. Sold, Split, and Russified. After Stephen, Moldova entered a long, grinding decline that unfolded across roughly 3 centuries and involved more foreign interference than any territory should reasonably have to absorb. The story of this period is essentially the story of a small, fertile principality being slowly eaten from multiple directions at once by the Ottomans from the south, by Poland, Lithuania from the north, by the boyar class from within, and eventually by a new and particularly voracious empire from the east. It's not a cheerful story, but it's an important one because it ends with a border being drawn across the middle of Moldova that still defines the country today. And it's a story that contains a lesson, if you're inclined to look for them, that geography and agricultural wealth, without the military or political capacity to defend them, are not advantages. They are invitations. The immediate successors to Stephen struggled badly. The boyar factionalism that Stephen had suppressed through a combination of authority and strategic violence came roaring back the moment he was in the ground. Rulers were installed and removed with increasing frequency, often with Ottoman backing, occasionally with Polish backing, sometimes with both simultaneously, which tells you something about how coherent Moldovan foreign policy had become. The Principality retained its internal structures, the Orthodox Church, the boyar estates, the basic administrative apparatus, but its autonomy was increasingly notional. Real decisions were made in Constantinople, Warsaw, or wherever the nearest powerful neighbour happened to be holding court that season. The average reign of a Moldovan prince in the 16th century was measured in years, occasionally months. Stability was not the order of the day. By the early 18th century, the Ottoman approach to governing Moldova had reached what you might charitably call peak cynicism. From 1711 onwards, the Porte began appointing rulers from the Fanar district of Constantinople, a neighbourhood of wealthy Greek merchant families who had accumulated influence in the Ottoman court over generations. These were the Fanariates, and they ran Moldova for over a century. The system worked like this. A Fanariot merchant family would pay the Ottoman Sultan for the right to rule Moldova. They would then arrive in the Principality, immediately begin taxing everything in sight to recoup their investment and turn a profit, and rotate out within a few years to be replaced by the next family with a sufficient bid. It was governance as franchise operation, with the franchise being squeeze the peasants until something valuable falls out. The Fanariates had no particular connection to Moldova, no investment in its long-term development, and every incentive to extract as much as possible before their tenure ended. Some were educated, cultured men who brought certain refinements of Ottoman Greek administration. One or two were genuinely capable administrators who improved infrastructure or patronized the arts. They were still, structurally, a system of organized looting with better table manners. The Moldovan peasantry, who bore the weight of all this taxation, presumably had a more colourful description. One figure stands apart from the general Fanariot mediocrity, though his story ends badly enough to fit right in. Dimitri Cantemir was a Moldovan prince of genuine intellectual distinction, a scholar, a musician, a linguist who spoke 11 languages, and a man who wrote foundational works on Ottoman history, music theory, and Moldovan geography that are still consulted by historians today. He was also a man who made one of the most consequential gambles in Moldovan history and lost. In 1711, Cantemir secretly allied with Peter the Great of Russia, who was marching south against the Ottomans in what he imagined would be a triumphant campaign. Cantemir declared Moldova's alliance with Russia and prepared to throw off Ottoman rule once and for all. The two armies met the Ottomans at the Battle of Stanilești on the Prut River, and the campaign was a disaster. The Russian and Moldovan forces were surrounded, heavily outnumbered, and nearly destroyed. Peter the Great escaped through negotiation, giving back significant concessions to the Ottomans and leaving Cantemir, whose position was now completely untenable, since backing a losing rebellion against the Ottomans was not the kind of thing they let slide, to flee north with the retreating Russian army. He spent the rest of his life in Russia, never returning to Moldova, producing a remarkable scholarly output that included one of the earliest systematic European histories of the Ottoman Empire. He's a fascinating man who got the timing catastrophically wrong, which in Moldova's history is practically a recurring character archetype. Russia, meanwhile, kept pushing steadily south and west. The 18th century saw a series of Russo-Turkish wars that repeatedly turned the Moldovan and Wallachian territories into battlegrounds, with Russian armies marching through, winning and losing, and signing treaties that advanced the empire's position incrementally southward and westward. Russia wanted the Black Sea, it wanted warm water ports, it wanted the strategic corridor that ran through precisely the territory Moldova occupied. Every war brought Russian influence a little closer. Moldovan peasants watched Russian and Ottoman armies march across their fields with the weary pragmatism of people who have learned that powerful strangers passing through rarely improve the harvest. And then came 1812. Napoleon Bonaparte was marching toward Moscow with the largest army Europe had ever assembled, and Tsar Alexander I, who had been fighting the Ottomans in yet another inconclusive war, desperately needed to free up his southern forces to deal with this somewhat more urgent threat from the west. The resulting Treaty of Bucharest, signed in May of 1812 with almost unseemly haste, ended the Russo-Turkish War. Russia got Bessarabia, the eastern portion of Moldova, the land between the Prut River and the Dniester. The western half of the Principality, west of the Prut, remained an Ottoman vassal. Just like that, in the middle of a diplomatic negotiation conducted largely for reasons having nothing to do with Moldova, the land between the rivers was cut in half. A border was drawn along the Prut. The same people, the same culture, the same language, the same church divided by a line that one of history's greatest chess matches had produced as a side effect. Moldova didn't get a vote. Moldova never got a vote. The Prut River, which had once been simply a river, became something else entirely. A fault line running through the middle of a people, and it has been one ever since. The region that Russia acquired was now called Bessarabia, a name derived from the Wallachian Bessarab dynasty, applied by the Russians to the entire eastern Moldova territory, even though the Bessarabs had no particular historical connection to most of it. Names, like borders, get assigned by whoever has the power to make them stick. Initially, Russia governed Bessarabia with some degree of autonomy, a local assembly, Romanian as an official language alongside Russian, a recognition that the region had its own distinct character and that heavy-handed integration might produce instability. This lasted about 16 years. By 1828, the autonomy arrangements were quietly dismantled, and Bessarabia was absorbed fully into the Russian imperial administrative system. The Romanian language was gradually removed from official use in schools and government. Russian settlers, along with Ukrainians, Bulgarians, and a Turkic Christian people called the Gagauz, were actively encouraged to move into the region, diluting its Romanian character. Russia's approach to managing its newly acquired territories followed a logic that was both cynical and effective. change who lives there until the original population becomes a minority in their own land, then point to the demographic reality as justification for continued control. It was a policy with a long future ahead of it, applied with variations across the entire sweep of Russian and later Soviet imperial territory. The Gagauz deserve a brief moment of attention here because they are one of history's more improbable communities. They are Turkic-speaking, linguistically related to Turkish but Orthodox Christian, which is an unusual combination. Their origin is disputed. Some scholars believe they descend from Seljuk Turks, who converted to Christianity in the medieval period. Others argue for a Cuman or Bulgarian ancestry. However they got there, they ended up in southern Bessarabia in significant numbers, and they're still there today. Modern Moldova has an autonomous region called Gagauzia in its south, with its own government and its own distinctive culture. Orthodox churches attended by people speaking a Turkic language, which is the kind of detail that makes you appreciate how complicated the concept of ethnic homeland really is. While Bessarabia was being Russified, the western half of Moldova was going through its own transformation. The revolutionary currents of 1848 swept through the Romanian-speaking territories, and out of those upheavals came a growing movement for the unification of Wallachia and Western Moldova, the two proto-Romanian principalities that had always shared a culture and a language, but had never been formally united. In 1859, Alexandru Ioan Cuza was elected prince of both territories simultaneously, creating in effect the state that would become Romania. It was a clever piece of political engineering. It was also a moment of enormous historical irony. The western half of Moldova was uniting with Wallachia to form a new nation, while the eastern half Bessarabia was sitting across the Prut under Russian rule, unable to participate, watching from the wrong side of the river. The great powers played their usual games with the Bessarabian border throughout the 19th century, treating it as a bargaining chip rather than a homeland. The Crimean War of 1853 to 1856 ended with Russia losing and being forced to return the three southern counties of Bessarabia to the new Romanian state, a brief, partial reunion of the divided territory. Then the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878 ended with Russia winning and demanding those same counties back, despite Romania having fought on Russia's side. The Congress of Berlin in 1878 formalized the deal. Romania handed over southern Bessarabia to Russia and received Dobruja, a coastal territory on the Black Sea, as compensation. The Romanians were not consulted in any meaningful sense. They were furious. But fury without military power is just noise, and the great powers were very good at not hearing noise from smaller nations. By the late 19th century, Bessarabia under Russian rule was a territory of suppressed identity and simmering resentment. The Romanian language survived in private life in homes, in villages, in the memory of an older generation, but it had been systematically pushed out of public institutions. A generation of Moldovan intellectuals and activists worked to keep the language alive through underground schools and clandestine publishing at considerable personal risk. The economy was agricultural and largely exploitative. Bessarabia's remarkable soil produced grain and wine that flowed out of the region, while the peasants who grew it remained poor. The cities had growing populations of Russians, Jews, Ukrainians, and other groups drawn in by trade and settlement policies, creating an increasingly complex ethnic mosaic. That complexity, combined with the Tsarist state's endemic anti-Semitism, produced one of the darkest episodes of this period. Chisinau, then called Kishinev in its Russian form, had a large and established Jewish community, as did most cities in the western reaches of the Russian Empire. In April of 1903, a pogrom erupted in the city. Over 3 days, mobs attacked Jewish homes, businesses, and synagogues. 49 people were killed. Hundreds were injured, Over 1,000 homes and businesses were destroyed. The Bessarabets newspaper, which had spent months publishing virulently anti-Semitic articles, had helped incite the violence, and the newspaper's connections to local government officials raised serious questions about official complicity or deliberate inaction. The Kishinev pogrom sent shockwaves internationally. Theodore Roosevelt condemned it publicly, and it accelerated the emigration of Jewish families from the region that was already well underway. It also stands as a sober reminder of what happens when state-tolerated hatred and an economic scapegoating of minorities goes unchecked for long enough. The year was 1903. Europe had 15 more years before the next catastrophe, and rather worse ones after that. By 1914, Bessarabia was restless, impoverished, culturally suppressed, and about to be swept up in a war that would redraw every map in Europe. The Tsarist Empire was cracking under the strain of industrialization, military failure, and revolutionary pressure that had been building since at least the failed revolution of 1905, when mutinies and peasant uprisings had briefly shaken the foundations of the regime before being suppressed. In Bessarabia, as across the empire, the peasants were hungry, the intellectuals were angry, the Jewish communities were traumatized and emigrating in waves, and the old order was running out of road. The next chapter would bring the First World War, the Russian Revolution, a brief and improbable moment of Moldovan self-determination that lasted just long enough to give everyone hope, and then the 20th century doing what the 20th century did best, which was take everything fragile and promising and put it through the worst possible series of tests. Chapter 5. The century that had it in for Moldova. If you were designing a century specifically calibrated to cause maximum suffering to a small, agriculturally rich, strategically positioned territory in Eastern Europe, you would design the 20th century. Every major catastrophe that Europe produced between 1914 and 1991 seemed to find its way to Moldova. Eventually, war, revolution, famine, deportation, occupation, reoccupation, genocide, and a sustained ideological project to convince the people living there that they weren't who they thought they were. Moldova went through all of it. It went through it with a population that had no meaningful military power, no reliable international allies, and no realistic capacity to refuse what the great powers imposed. What follows is an account of how that played out, and it requires some steadiness to get through. Take a breath. We're going in. The First World War broke the Russian Empire. By 1917, Tsar Nicholas II had abdicated. The provisional government was itself collapsing under Bolshevik pressure, and the vast administrative apparatus that had governed Bessarabia for over a century simply ceased to function coherently. Supply chains broke down. Local authorities stopped receiving instructions from Petrograd. The currency was inflating. Soldiers were deserting. The entire imperial infrastructure that had held this territory since 1812 was dissolving in real time. Into that vacuum, with remarkable speed and organizational energy, the Bessarabians created something they hadn't had in over 100 years, a representative assembly. The Sfatul Tsari, the Council of the Land, convened in Chisinau in December of 1917, drawing delegates from Moldovan peasant organizations, political parties, ethnic minority communities, and professional groups. It was imperfect, fractious, and operating in conditions of genuine chaos. It was also the first meaningful exercise of Bessarabian political self-determination since the Russian annexation of 1812. In January of 1918, the Assembly declared the Moldavian Democratic Republic independent from Russia. For a brief, improbable moment, Moldova was a republic, Nobody quite knew what to do with that, including the Moldovans. It lasted about 3 months as an independent entity before the next decision arrived. In April of 1918, the Sfatul Tsari voted on union with Romania. The result was 86 votes in favour, 3 against, 36 abstentions. After 106 years of separation, Bessarabia voted to rejoin the Romanian state. Romanian troops were already present in the territory, which critics then and now have noted as a complicating factor the extent to which the vote reflected genuine popular will versus the presence of an army is a question historians still argue about. But the vote happened, the numbers were what they were, and the union was declared. The Prut River border, that fault line drawn in 1812, was erased. For the first time in over a century, the two halves of Moldova were in the same country. The interwar period in Bessarabia was not the triumphant reunion that Romanian nationalists had imagined. Romanian administration brought the restoration of the Romanian language in schools and official life, and a land reform that broke up the large estates and distributed land to peasants' genuinely popular measures. It also brought Romanian bureaucratic corruption, economic inequality, political heavy-handedness, and a general tendency to treat Bessarabia as a peripheral region to be administered rather than a community to be integrated. The enthusiasm of 1818 was not matched by the governance of the 1920s and 30s. Many Bessarabians who had voted for union found themselves wondering, within a decade, whether they had made the right calculation. History did not give them long to reconsider. The Soviet Union had never accepted the 1818 union. From Moscow's perspective, Bessarabia was Romanian-occupied Soviet territory, and the claim was kept alive with characteristic creativity. In 1924, the Soviets created the Moldavian Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic, a small strip of territory on the eastern bank of the Dniester, in what is now Transnistria, populated largely by Ukrainians and Russians. It had no historical connection to the medieval Principality of Moldova, no significant Moldovan-speaking population, and no obvious reason to exist except as a political placeholder, a flag planted on the map saying, "We're coming back," which, 15 years later, they did. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of August 1939 is one of history's more cynical documents, which is saying something given the competition. The secret protocol attached to the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression agreement carved up Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence, with the casual confidence of two men dividing a restaurant bill, except the bill was other people's countries. Bessarabia fell into the Soviet column. Nazi Germany, which was about to invade Poland and needed the Soviets to stay out of the way, had effectively handed Stalin the green light to take back the territory Russia had lost in 1918. Stalin waited until the summer of 1940, when France had just collapsed and Britain was fighting for survival. The United States was still officially neutral, and the moment seemed maximally auspicious. In June of 1940, a Soviet ultimatum arrived in Bucharest: hand over Bessarabia and northern Bukovina within 48 hours or face invasion. Romania, which had no meaningful allies willing to intervene in a crisis they all had their own problems to deal with, complied. Soviet troops marched across the Prut. The Romanian administration packed up and left. The border that had been erased in 1918 was reinstated in a matter of days. The whole thing took less than a week, which is roughly how long it takes to undo a century of history when you have enough tanks. The Soviets also took northern Bukovina, which had not even been mentioned in the Molotov-Ribbentrop secret protocol. It had never been part of the Russian Empire. It had no historical Soviet claim attached to it. It was simply there and undefended, and Stalin wanted it. Romania had no recourse. In August of 1940, the Moldavian Soviet Socialist Republic was formally created. Bessarabia merged with a slice of the old Transnistrian massa, deliberately configured to dilute Bessarabian Romanian identity with a larger Slavic population. The new republic's borders were drawn not to reflect any historical or demographic reality, but to produce the most administratively manageable, which is to say, most controllable unit possible. This was Soviet cartography, borders as tools of governance. Less than a year later, in June of 1941, Romania joined Nazi Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union. Within weeks, Romanian and German forces had swept through Bessarabia and northern Bukovina, pushing Soviet forces back and reclaiming the territory. The speed of the reconquest was dizzying the same ground that had changed hands in 1918, 1940, now changed hands again in 1941, and then the Romanian administration did something that deserves to be named plainly, because it is under-acknowledged in the general history of the Holocaust. It used the territory east of the Dniester, a region called Transnistria, handed to Romanian administration by the German-Romanian alliance as a killing ground. Jews from Bessarabia, Bukovina, and Romania proper were deported there in enormous numbers. Roma populations were also targeted. Estimates of the dead range from 250,000 to 300,000 Jews, along with tens of thousands of Roma, the Romanian Holocaust. It happened. It was organized. It was policy. In 1944, the Soviet counteroffensive swept back through Bessarabia. Romania switched sides, joining the Allies too late to undo what had happened, but in time to be on the correct side at the armistice table. Bessarabia returned to Soviet control, where it would remain for 47 years. What followed was a Soviet project of extraordinary thoroughness. Deportations came in waves. June of 1941, just before the German invasion, when the first sweep targeted anyone the Soviet state had identified as a potential threat in the new territory. Former officials, landowners, professionals, military officers and their families. And then July of 1949, in the operation called Operațiune Sud, Operation South, when tens of thousands more Bessarabian families were loaded onto cattle wagons and sent to Siberia and Kazakhstan. The targets were enemies of the people, former landowners, intellectuals, members of pre-Soviet organizations, anyone who had held any official position under Romanian rule, plus their families, plus anyone who looked at a party official the wrong way at the wrong moment. The deportation lists were drawn up by local informants and NKVD officers working from pre-prepared categories. Families were separated at the station. Many died in transit. Many more died in the camps and special settlements of the Soviet East. Some returned decades later to find their houses occupied, their language suppressed, and their children raised as Soviet citizens who had been taught their parents were criminals. The famine of 1946 and 1947 deserves its own full pause. A severe drought reduced harvests across the Soviet South in 1946. This part was nature's doing. What followed was not. The response of the Soviet state was to continue requisitioning grain from Moldova and Ukraine, even as the population began to starve, enforcing collection quotas against communities that had nothing left to give, dispatching teams to search homes and barns for hidden reserves, confiscating seed grain that farmers had kept back to plant for the following year. The result was a famine that killed an estimated 150,000 to 200,000 people in the Moldavian SSR alone, out of a population of roughly 2.5 million. Villages emptied, parents outlived children, people ate bark, grass, and things that are not food. Whether this constitutes deliberate policy or criminal negligence on a catastrophic scale is debated by historians, and the distinction has real moral weight. What is not debated is the sequence of events. The grain kept moving out of Moldova, the people kept dying in Moldova, and the Soviet state was aware of both simultaneously. The famine is not well known outside the region. In Moldova, it is not forgotten. Collectivization dismantled what remained of peasant agriculture. The chernozem, that extraordinary black earth that empires had coveted for centuries, was handed to collective farms, stripped of private ownership, and managed by Soviet bureaucrats whose incentives ran toward meeting production quotas rather than sustainable farming. Productivity collapsed. The Soviets compensated by industrializing the Transnistrian bank of the Dniester building factories, power plants, and heavy industry on the eastern strip, creating an industrial base that was efficient at producing Soviet outputs and entirely dependent on Soviet supply chains. This industrial geography would matter enormously when the Soviet Union eventually dissolved, and the two banks of the Dniester found themselves in different political futures. Through all of this, the Soviets worked systematically to sever Moldova's cultural connection to Romania. The official position was that Moldovan was a separate language from Romanian, not a dialect, not a variant, but a distinct language, written in Cyrillic script, with its own literary tradition and its own historical identity. It was not true. Moldovan and Romanian are the same language, a fact linguists have never seriously disputed. But the Soviets were not doing linguistics, they were doing identity management, and the Cyrillic script was the instrument. If you write Romanian in Cyrillic long enough, the children who grow up with it cannot read the books and newspapers published across the Prut, cannot connect easily with Romanian literature and history, are that much more legible as Moldovan rather than Romanian. It was a policy of deliberate cultural amputation conducted in school curricula and printing presses and official documents over 4 decades. By the 1980s, Moldova was one of the poorest Soviet republics, its agricultural potential throttled by collective farming, its industrial development concentrated in Transnistria, its cultural identity officially re-engineered across 4 decades of deliberate policy. But Gorbachev's glasnost was opening fissures across the Soviet system, and Moldova was no exception. In 1989, massive demonstrations filled the streets of Chisinau, hundreds of thousands of people, night after night, demanding the restoration of the Romanian language and the Latin script. The authorities watched, uncertain. The old reflexes send in the security forces, arrest the ringleaders, wait for the protest to exhaust itself, were losing their automatic authority. Something had shifted. People who had spent their whole lives not saying certain things in public were saying them. In the same year, across the Soviet Union, similar awakenings were convulsing the Baltic states. Georgia, Armenia, Ukraine. The language law passed in Moldova in August of 1989 was a symbolic earthquake. Romanian declared the state language, the Cyrillic script abandoned, the Soviet fiction of a separate Moldovan tongue formally challenged. It was, in its own way, an act of defiance that reached back through 70 years of Soviet policy and said, "We know who we are." The question of what to do with that knowledge, whether to reunite with Romania, become fully independent, or find some third path through a landscape full of competing pressures and unresolved grievances, remained fiercely, dangerously unresolved as the Soviet Union began its final, lurching collapse. The answer, when it came, would satisfy almost nobody. Chapter 6. The Long Way Home. Moldova declared independence on the 27th of August, 1991, as the Soviet Union came apart around it like a slow-motion architectural collapse. It was not, by most accounts, a jubilant occasion. Independence had been thrust upon Moldova rather than seized by it. The country's political factions couldn't agree on whether to reunite with Romania, remain in some form of Soviet successor arrangement, or go it alone as a genuinely sovereign state. The pro-Romania faction wanted union. The communist establishment wanted a softer landing within a reconstituted Soviet framework. The minorities, the Gagauz, the Russian speakers, the Transnistrian population wanted guarantees that Romanian nationalism wouldn't make them second-class citizens in their own homes. Independence was the compromise that nobody fully wanted, arrived at by a process of elimination rather than shared enthusiasm. Welcome to nationhood. Here's a flag. Good luck with the rest of it. The luck in the early years was not good. Within months of independence, Moldova was at war with itself. The Transnistrian conflict had been building since 1990, when the Slavic majority population of the East Bank, alarmed by the language laws, the Romanian nationalism, the apparent drift toward union with Romania, declared their own separate republic. When the newly independent Moldovan state attempted to assert sovereignty over the territory in the spring of 1992, fighting broke out along the Dniester. Moldovan police and volunteer fighters on one side, Transnistrian forces, and, crucially, the Russian 14th Army on the other. The Russian 14th Army was stationed in Transnistria as a legacy of Soviet deployment. Its commander, General Alexander Lebed, a blunt and forceful man who would later become a significant figure in Russian politics, made a decision. The precise degree to which it was authorized from Moscow remains contested to intervene effectively on the Transnistrian side. Russian tanks and firepower ended the Moldovan advance. Several hundred people were killed, tens of thousands were displaced. A ceasefire was signed in July of 1992. The result was the frozen conflict that Moldova has lived with ever since. Transnistria functions as an independent state in every practical sense. Its own government, its own army, its own currency, its own passport that no other country recognizes, its own Soviet-era aesthetic preserved in remarkably intact condition. Lenin still stands in the main square in Tiraspol, the Transnistrian capital, looking out over a city that feels like a film set for a production about 1982. Russia keeps peacekeepers in the territory. Moldova has no control over what happens on the East Bank. And in a detail that encapsulates the absurdity of the situation perfectly, the Cucuteni power plant, which sits in Transnistria, generates a large portion of Moldova's electricity. For decades, Moldova was dependent on a breakaway territory it couldn't govern for the power to keep its lights on. The bill for that electricity was often unpaid, which is the kind of arrangement that would make a utility company nervous and has, in fact, made Moldova nervous for 30 years. The 1990s were economically catastrophic. Moldova's GDP fell by roughly 60% in the early years of independence, a collapse almost without parallel in the post-Soviet world. The industrial base was almost entirely in Transnistria, which was now a separate entity. The collective farms had been dismantled, but the agricultural sector hadn't recovered. Hyperinflation ate savings. Unemployment was structural and widespread. The infrastructure, roads, hospitals, schools had been built for a Soviet system that no longer existed and hadn't been meaningfully maintained for years before that. Moldova introduced its own currency, the leu, in 1993 and eventually stabilized it, but stabilizing a currency is a very long way from stabilizing an economy or feeding a family. The defining economic response of the Moldovan people to this situation was to leave. The emigration wave that had been building since the Soviet collapse became a flood. Italy, Portugal, Russia, Romania, Germany, wherever work was available and the paperwork was navigable, Moldovans went. Construction sites in Rome, care homes in Lisbon, markets in Moscow. By the mid-2000s, estimates suggested that somewhere between a quarter and a third of Moldova's working-age population was living abroad. Villages emptied. Children grew up raised by grandparents, while their parents sent money home from a country those children had never visited. The remittances flowing in from the diaspora became one of the largest single components of Moldova's economy, a country sustained, in significant part, by the people who had left it. The political story of the 1990s and 2000s is one of corruption, oscillation, and institutional fragility. Moldova's government cycled between pro-Russian and pro-European orientations with a regularity that reflected genuine divisions in the population rather than any stable consensus. The Communist Party, which, to be clear, was not your grandfather's Communist Party, but a rebranded political vehicle with authoritarian tendencies and strong ties to the Russian-speaking community, won the 2001 election and held power for much of the decade under President Vladimir Voronin. Voronin started his tenure with close ties to Moscow, then drifted toward Brussels, then drifted back. Consistency was not the order of the day. What was consistent was the corruption. A class of oligarchs and political insiders who had accumulated control of key economic assets in the chaos of the transition, and who were remarkably effective at translating that economic power into political influence, and political influence back into economic power. The courts were captured. The media was largely owned by people with political interests. Civil society existed but operated under pressure. Moldova had the institutions of a democracy, elections, a parliament, a constitution, a flag, a national anthem, and a political class that treated those institutions as a stage set behind which the real business of enrichment continued undisturbed. The wine economy, which had been Moldova's most distinctive export, illustrated the vulnerability of the country's position with particular clarity. Russia had been the dominant market for Moldovan wine and cognac for decades. In 2006, Russia banned Moldovan wine imports, officially citing quality concerns, actually applying economic pressure against Moldova's drift toward the European Union. The ban was devastating. Wineries that had been exporting to Russia for generations suddenly had nowhere to send their product. The government scrambled. The industry had to reinvent itself, rapidly and at great cost, redirecting toward European markets that had different standards, different palates, and different expectations. It took years. The silver lining, and there was one, eventually was that the enforced diversification produced a Moldovan wine industry that emerged genuinely stronger, with higher quality standards and more diverse markets. The Russian ban that was meant to punish Moldova ended up, over the long run, making Moldovan wine better. You could call that justice. You could also call it an extremely painful way to improve your product. The 2009 Twitter revolution was a turning point of a different kind. When the Communist Party claimed victory in a disputed parliamentary election, protesters took to the streets of Chisinau, young, connected, organising partly through social media in what became one of the earliest examples of that phenomenon in Eastern Europe. The protests turned violent. Parts of the Parliament building were stormed and burned. The crackdown was brutal, with hundreds arrested and credible reports of police beatings in detention. The communists held on briefly, then lost their parliamentary majority through subsequent political manoeuvring, and a coalition of pro-European parties calling themselves the Alliance for European Integration took power. It was messy, inconclusive, and took years of fragile coalition building to consolidate. 3 different presidents were elected and rejected by Parliament during this period. Moldova went without a president for nearly 3 years due to the deadlock. It was also a genuine shift. The pro-EU forces were in power for the first time, and the direction of travel, however chaotic, had changed. What followed was promising and then catastrophic. The Alliance for European Integration negotiated visa-free travel to the European Union for Moldovan citizens, introduced in 2014, which was a genuinely transformative development for a poor country. The ability to travel, work and study in Europe without a visa changed the calculus for a generation of young Moldovans. The EU Association Agreement was signed the same year. Moldova was moving. And then, also in 2014, the banking scandal landed like a bomb. $1 billion in amount, roughly equal to 12 to 15% of Moldova's entire gross domestic product, was stolen from 3 Moldovan banks through a complex fraud scheme organized by an oligarch named Ilan. Sure, the money vanished into offshore accounts and foreign shell companies. The Moldovan state, meaning Moldovan taxpayers, was left holding the debt. $1 billion. Stolen. Gone. Ilan Shah was eventually convicted but had already fled to Israel, from which he continued to run a political party explicitly funded by Russia and dedicated to disrupting Moldova's EU path. The scale of the theft and the impunity with which it was conducted destroyed whatever remained of public trust in Moldovan institutions and triggered the largest protests the country had seen since independence. Recovery from that low point was slow and then, with one election, suddenly accelerating. In 2020, Maia Sandu was elected President of Moldova. Sandu is a Harvard-educated former World Bank official and former education minister, anti-corruption to a degree that her opponents found genuinely threatening, and pro-European, with a clarity and consistency that Moldova's political landscape had rarely seen. She was also Moldova's first female president, which in a country with this particular history felt like its own kind of statement. Her Party of Action and Solidarity won a parliamentary majority in 2021, the first time a single pro-EU party had held a clear majority in Moldova's history. For the first time since independence, Moldova had a government and a president aligned, functional, and pointed in the same direction. Then Russia invaded Ukraine in February of 2022, and Moldova's situation went from complicated to urgent. Moldova shares a long border with Ukraine. Russian missiles were flying over Moldovan territory. The country that had spent 30 years trying to stay neutral and avoid provoking Moscow was suddenly on the front edge of Europe's largest war since 1945. The refugee crisis was immediate and enormous. At its peak, Moldova, a country of 2.5 million people, was hosting over 100,000 Ukrainian refugees, one of the highest per capita refugee burdens anywhere in Europe. The Moldovan people, for all their poverty and exhaustion, opened their homes. Moldova applied for European Union membership in June of 2022. The EU granted candidate status. Accession negotiations opened in 2024. The constitutional referendum of 2024, which wrote EU membership as a national goal into the Moldovan constitution, passed narrowly. Amid credible reports of Russian-funded vote-buying schemes and information warfare, it passed anyway. And Transnistria, that frozen Soviet relic on the east bank of the Dniester, found itself in an increasingly strange position as the war reshaped the region. The Russian troops stranded there couldn't easily be reinforced. The supply route ran through Ukraine, which was at war with Russia. Transnistria, which had spent 30 years as a Russian client state, quietly began importing Romanian gas after Russia cut off its supplies in late 2024. The Lenin statues are still standing in Tiraspol. The Soviet flag still flies. But the economics of the situation were pulling in a different direction from the politics, and that tension quietly was building. Moldova today is a country in genuine transition, not the frustrated theoretical transition of the 1990s, but a transition with a destination written into its constitution and a government that, for the first time in 30 years, seems to mean it. The poverty is real and persistent. The institutions are fragile. Russian interference hasn't stopped. The Transnistrian question has no obvious resolution. The energy dependence that left Moldova vulnerable for decades has not been fully solved. These are not small problems, but the diaspora is beginning to return, drawn by a sense that something is actually changing. Chisinau has a startup scene. The wine industry is winning awards in Paris and London. Young Moldovans are studying in Bucharest and Berlin and coming back with skills and expectations. The country that was named after a river outside its borders, that spent centuries being divided and conquered and redivided, that lost its coastline and its language, and hundreds of thousands of its people to famine and deportation and emigration, that country is carefully, stubbornly planting something new in that extraordinary black earth. Whether it takes root is the question Moldova is living through right now, in real time, while the rest of Europe watches and the outcome is genuinely uncertain, which, if you've been listening to this story from the beginning, is honestly the most Moldovan ending possible. Still here, still trying, still quietly rooted, waiting to see what grows,